2. Nature of the Unit 2 Nature of the State Structure 20 Introduction 2.1 Unit Objectives 2.2 Formulations and Postulations of the Ancient Indian Political Thought 23 Despotism versus Republic 2. 4. Concept of Static Village Community 2.5 Summary 2.6 Key Terms 2.7 Answers to Check Your Progress 28 Questions and Exercises 29 Further Readings 2. 0. Introduction. The term state refers to a form of polity that is characterized as a centralized organization. There is no single, undisputed definition of what constitutes a state. Some states are sovereign, while other states are subject to external sovereignty or hegemony, where supreme authority lies in another state. The term state also applies to federated states that are members of a federation, in which sovereignty is shared between member states and a federal body. In this unit, you will study about the nature of state in ancient India, the formulations and postulations of ancient Indian political thought, differences between despotism and the republics, and the concept of static village community 2.1 Unit Objectives. After going through this unit, you will be able to describe the nature of the state in ancient India, analyze the formulations and postulations of the ancient Indian political thought, discuss the difference between despotism and the republics, analyze the concept of the static village community 2. 2. Formulations and postulations of the ancient Indian political thought. The nature of the state in ancient India is one of the most discussed topics in history. Historians entered long debates since the 19th century till date to understand the structures of the ancient polities. In the middle of the 1970s and early 1980s, the debate reached its zenith. Before that, A.S. Aljika, Kan Sastry and Surjit Sinha enriched our ideas on the subject. In the 1950s, D.D. Kasambi and R.S. Sharma debated over the topic, influenced by man ideas. Scholars like Sharma looked for social and economic basis for state struct. Only in the 1970s alternative versions began to emerge. Factors beyond socio-economic foundations were emphasized. Economic and technological factors were two central themes. Factors like social hierarchy, cultural engagements, distributive resources were now seen as pivotal ideas for the emergence of the state. Herman Kulp nurtured these new thoughts. They based their studies on Th. Romula Thapa, B.D. Chattopadhyaya, G. W. Spencer, Bertenstein observation of the socio-cultural and historical developments that led to the formulation of the political state. Thapa's study focused on the early Historia stage, while Chattopadhyaya dwelled on the early medieval centuries and Kulp and Stein on early medieval and medieval times. In general, they encompassed the roles of social, economic and cultural domains in the formation of the polity. Further, more recent scholars focused on the comparative studies of India and other ancient host societies of the world and carved out a general theory of state formation. They also concentrated on sub-regions and local tribal societies to understand the historical base of larger states. They nurtured the theories of plurality and interconnectedness that was once forwarded by Kasambi. The constant interaction between the Kshetra and the Vana, or between the Brahmanical society and the forest, played central role in the formation of the ancient state. The state was in way a solo achievement of the powerful. Below we will name the various dehas on state formation in ancient India 1950s and R.S. Sharma D.D. Kasambi initiated the idea of interconnections and plurality. He drew our attention to the role of the tribal polities in the historical evolution of ancient Indian political system. But later his ideas went to the backdrop to make way to me-centrist visions. R.S. Sharma shifted from this view and almost removed tribes from the debate. He did not focus much on the marginal polities in the history state formation. His attention was more on large durable structures and how they survived through time. He strengthened the idea of Indian feudalism and explained the political history of India through that frame. Here we will name some details. The ideas of Sharma. He categorized the theories as the Saptanga theory, the role of property, family and caste in the formation of the state, and the contract. Then the theories are described below. 1. The Saptanga theory of the state. The Dharmasutras do not tell us much about the definition of the state. The reason was that the institution was not yet evolved to a mature stage at that time. It was only after rise of states like Kosala and Magadha in the age of Buddha century BCE that the state was dead-messed for the first time in the author of Cornus, consisting of 7 elements. The definition of state we get in this text became standard for the texts that followed. It is the Saptap 7 elements, theory of the state. The Sarunlasa, a text of the 16th century AD, sent the definition to Gautama, though the Buddhist law books are quite silent on this subject. Though like I mentioned in the previous text, it was the Isis that defined the state for the first time. The 7 elements enumerated by Kautilya were Swam, Derika, Durga, Kesdu and Maya. All these 7 elements dealt with Parvati. Though in other texts we don't get exact synonyms of these terms, Sharma drew their meanings from the developed states of later days. The Vishamottara Purana, a work of about the 5th century AD, added 2 new elements, Samu, pacification, and Dona, charity, respectively in the places of mind. Man Kautilya, however, did not define the elements of Amanu and charge, but the other elements are elaborated and clearly defined in his treatise. Sham meant the head of master. It refers to headship both in monarchies and republics. Rajas, the main element of polity. Without him, to state system could run. Kautilya pointed out to the weakness of Vera, or the non-monarchical state where Swami or the ruler was absent. Swami is also mentioned in the Sakka inscriptions. It is significant that neither Kautilya nor the Sakka evidences used the term Raja. They rather preferred Swami, which literally means master. The intention might be to stress on the sense of authority of the head of the state. Kautilya opined that the Swami should be endowed with some essential qualities like noble birth, wisdom, enthusiasm and personal ability. The quality of noble birth is significant, as it was given that a person from humble birth could not quality for being the ruler of a state. The second element of manaya is mentioned in almost all texts. The usual translation of the term manaya is minister, and the general idea is that a small group of ministers used to rule the state. But texts like the Sant Pain of the Mahabharata mentioned the names of about 37 mans. They were distinguished from the mantrins, whose number was 8. According to the Arthasastra, the Amabas constituted a band of officials from which the chief priest, ministers, collectors, treasurers, officers engaging in civil and criminal administration, officers in charge of the harem, envoys and superintendents of various departments were recruited. As we get mention of an identical category called the Amaka in the Pali texts, it seems that in the pre-Maurya times the number of Amans rose as high as 100. They observed duties of the village headman, supervisors of sales transactions, judges, guides in worldly and spiritual matters, surveyors, etc. In the early Maurya times probably the Amanu functioned as close friends of the king. But gradually their duties expanded and it almost became identical to those of the ministers. The Jalikas too have elaborate passages on the role of the Amanus. Notes Narsal or Theware on the implant that they should have delimit, is so should be ho visant should by laborias the number of on the duties of the lower inner padathebus, artisans. Traders and hand-working and constitute the lowest strate of society. Comendador gave a clear picture and the king should live in a country mostly united be address few. The number of taverns should be high. The producing militia or commodate the main put on the sputation. The same. The largestrum within the should consist of 800 villages. The fourth olomet anonymat in Kotira is changed that literally mouse but it is often used as a swim once to a fortific capital Cambo 2. Elaborate sections. When in charge the former mat win stress and the later the planning and layout of the capital. A various expertise mentioned in this connection artisans dealing with her thread, bamboo hide weapons, metal and gems were a part of the charge. Our contribution in planning and construction is acknowledged in the TXTS. The fifth element is cost or treasury. Cortilla has suggested that the trees accumulated through the means should be stored in the royal treasury. West Ruffi the probable wealth of the king. His treasury should be filled up with gold, silver, precious jewels and gems. The treasury should generously supply means to the people in times of famines or other calamities, and it should also finance THEMs. The sixth element is condor coercive power. In Cortilla's time the my was consisted of hereditary hired, forest and corporation soldiers consisted infantry, chariots, elephants and cavalry. The Santi Prava referred to the army at Lara or a set of 8 elements. These elements were elephants, horses, chariots, infantry, boats, forced labor, indigenous and hired soldiers. The warrior caste, were preferred as most efficient members of the army. Albram Nicol and his texts assigned the duty of fighting to them. In Mont we find that the drummers and valshers were allowed to bear arms but never the sudhas. Cortilla opined that the army should be fully financed by the state. The families of the dead soldiers should get regular means from the Royal Chokka. He assigns a lot of qualities to the army. Personnel. He should be patient, invincible, skilled in work and should be indifferent to losses and gains. The seventh and the last element is well or friend, who is also known as Thed in other texts. Cortilla thought that alliance with the friend should be hereditary. Milo should be ready help the king whenever needed. Now Eliam 4 miles ruch air out of the in this order single and loche sur 10. But this same that the Elwi print elect later dine 1001 only tax the elements of the state mentioned above are mostly the product of www. Bass rise to thekathu non home in the band hosts do we get tweeties of few as tantus bilu of and test ARS it covers almost al show the www of war the master dotties of sovereignty. Oven manipulation demand to the disguise of Cortilla. They even as to the software the most ended contribution is that he will the wondering connection in between the state and it rel detailed the measures of protection Tim www ties like we are. Stated the PR time at www. These elements on the roll of property family and custer was the malor will healthiest and on white bow of a pout die were only emphasize ends of the rise of perts. But also referred to the role of family host. They had the opinion that men esteemed bedded houses in order to hide the shameful tsar sexual intercourse. Each house contained a sit family. The pananas canosted the rise of the state to the war wisdom. Were meant forms hus for war use or DW serving the 3 apurkists in permale view the state mergel to check the struggle between different way. The duty of the state was to estrin the well and protect the weaks of tat. His theory is found in the most ancient sources support the fact that the duty of the king was to private property by punishing the Thed Amshit, the Sanskritis Trents and the Tamil classic. Both assign the king with the contract theory. The fistation of the contract theory was in the wars that des the election of the king mang the gods for the purpose of fighting the Azuris we get a carnation ceremony of a king presided by Prajapati Brahma. The passis up contract they was the process of election. The system or session is often just want with the much celebrate social contrast theory of Berry contradicts our conventional idea that city was basically at Khalidi where kingship was hereditary. The reference to election gives us different idea of kinship and state formation. The Bhaktas text now refers to the same system. The individuals elected this was gained titles such as Mohammed Khan and the head of the state used to interfere only if there was a violence of law. The people had a part of their paklias taxed to the king. The continenary texture mentioned that the amount of tax was 1/6 of the prosh not for roll the tribal society's formation of the ancient state. Romulo Thappa's area of interest was the Met since the 1970s. Scholars stressed on the role of the marginal communities and of the state in the mid-first millennium BCE in the Middle Ganga Valley and the reinterpretation of the Mauryan Empire, S. in Eviratan. On the other hand, works B.D. Chattopadhyay and Herman Karl. Bertenstein's model was on the post-Maurya Anwar and Kalinga states, the idea being elaborated methy complicated. He imagined a segmentary state, formed on the basis of Brahmin peasant alliance and also focused on the integrity of the agrarian order in S.U. Thappa's interesting discussion on the multi-layered formation of the also informs the unstable political situation in northern India in the age of Bush. She stated that in the Middle Ganga Plain states like Kosala or Magadha Emery because all the necessary conditions for state formation were present there Sambas in the Ganga Valley and the community ownership of land triggered India comparatively, in the Terai, foothills of the Himalayas, or Gorakhpur in northern Bihar. The socio-economic conditions were absent, the presence of the Gub formation. The high-yielding paddy cultivation also contributed to the processus. From archaeological evidence we come to know that the material wealth W spread mainly in northern parts and in the fringes of central India. The Mauryan Empire was the outcome of a series of favorable situations for state formation in the northern Gangetic plain. It gathered its wealth from the huge revenue collected from the vast northern Indian plain. In other parts of India the ideal conditions for state formation were not present. Post-Maurya Deccan and the Karst coast saw uneven political developments. The Maharathas, Mahabhajas, Kuras, and Nandis. More prominently the Satavahanas and Mahamegavahanas can be categorized as secondary states. The rise of the Mahajanapadas too corresponds to the idea of secondary states. Various parts of India saw the rise of regional states. The Matharas and Easter Gangas of Kalinga, Ikshvakas and Visnukandins of Andhra, Sirabhapuriyas of Daksina Kosala, Vakatikas of Vidarbha, Kadambas of Kuntala, Pallavas of Tonde Mandala are some of the examples. Regions were formed in the early medieval period. Risco the Rajput states is one such important example of region making in the early medieval period. Regional polities integrated scattered principalities. The Yadava state comprised parts of Konkan, Disa and Vidarbha, and the Kakatiya domain united the regions of Telangana, coastal Andhra and Rayalaseema. The ancient Indian states owe a lot to the tribal cultures around them. Sanskrit literature divided space into 2 broad categories Vana Iranaya and Janapada etc. While the former represented jungle, the later meant plough agriculture and settled habitation. Tribal population was mainly inhabitants of the forest and had wide socio-cultural difference from the sedentary states. Ancient scriptures and Wofot met in Malkul and Kul not Vidog. The incorporated as no so HOLOL Neid read DM Cyrillic letter SSC WWWT the heat that there were constants between WWWTH Emishad Toj Tribales and made them a part of their wishing to Alale Meestums. The Hones Intra calendar www. Learn know of agricultural techniques to the trial groups. The notion on tribal and agrarian societies was a significant key aspect of the making an ancient and Gathama Sareshman worked on the integration of the trial calls into the state stem. The Hindu elements and the tribal traditions consisted well the release on the other. The local met the universal local religious coished as the interested with the local intentions. Tivan today we can whisk the concept deities of different traditions at places like Pampanga Padhapa in Maharashtra, Lapanatha of Peri in Orissa. Uslan when the way in which the goddess Stamheswari was incorporated within the Jagortha culture Sabhadra. This kind of examples informs us a lot about the invasion of tribal deities into the Aryan culture. Surjit Sinha K.S. Singh have done enriching research on the theme of assimilation and interaction between various traditions. B. Chattopadhyay that the Rajputs in early medieval Rajasthan emerged from local ruling societies. They embodied the symbolic relationship between state and forests. Herman Kulk in his case study of Orissa traced the origin of Hindu Rajas in Isolchiks and Chiefdoms. J. Bhattacharya observed similarly developments in northeastern India. Chattopadhyay and Kulk arguments were used on the abacus continuum. This form of analysis almost became a standard for researching on the origins of the ancient state. Since the 1990s, scholars have drawn their evidences from various regions of India such as Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, Bengal and Pradesh. The interaction between Romanical and non-Sanskriti popular cultures, even the nature of festivals, support the fact that the emergence of early state was a process of constant exchanges between various traditions. The Hinduration of the tribals and the tribalization of the Hindus became the most common mode of state-making in ancient India, and the process continued till medieval period. We can trace the emergence of rithvas or pilgrimages outside Jinjiti, northern India. Many of the chiefs and kings were directly involved with these religious spaces. They took part in ritual practices. The Tirthas mostly emerged in Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa and Jharkhand. Along with them, multiplied the number of temples. The ruling dynasties patronized their construction. Many of these temples were directly associated with local tribal deities. Religious interaction resulted in political exchange as well. The Chenchas at Sri Salem, Boyas at Draksharama, Sabanas at Puri and Kurutas at Tirupati are fine examples that support this argument. The locations of the temples too are enough for fornital integration into the Brahmanical religious practices. MLK. Murthy researched on the eastern Ghats in Anpao and pointed to the strategic location of Shaivite and Vaishnavite temples on the top of the hills and on the passes. Two major channels of tribal state in the Gupta and post-Gupta centuries. The first stage was character S. We can trace three interrelated stages in the evolution of the structure. Notes their presence of tribal chiefs and chiefdoms and their gradual transformation. Some Hindu Rajas and early kingdoms. These Rajas, after extending control over respective territories, tried to include the tribal principalities within their jurisdiction. The defeated kings were turned into tributary rulers and were no Samantas. The system came to be known as Samantachakra. The large May states emerged through a repeat of this process, and this process went along with agrarian expansion. Agricultural expansion assured dominance of and subordination of local politics. Check your progress. 1. What is the fourth element mentioned in Kautilya? 2. Where do we get the first mention of contract theory? 2. 3. Despotism versus republic. It is generally presumed that the commonly prevalent system of government ancient India was monarchy, and instances of republic were either exception aberrations. The view is based on the apparent perception that since their kings in ancient India, the system was that of monarchy. But a group of his argued that the system in ancient India was closer to a republic than to Modo. It differed from both in many essential matters. The system had features but was closer to a republic than a monarchy. Some scholars label this system as Ganatantra, a distinct system from republic as well as monarchy. Benoy Kumasaka was one of the prominent scholars working at nature of the republic in ancient India. He compared the nature of the high polities with the idea of enlightened despotism of late medieval Europe. Pope Frederick, Catherine and Joseph of 17th century Austria, Prussia and Rus embodied the idea of enlightened despots. The political psychology that lay by the Hindu institutions was not different in any way from that of the French under the Bourbons or of the Germans till the War of the Liberation. But it is now a known fact that the Hindu constitution grew along republican or non-monarch lines too. Archaeological evidences declare that there were at least 3 corps in the early history of India during which Hindus developed the Verapolity of the Hellenic and pre-imperial Roman type. Vedic and post-Vedic period. The Aryans had no monarchical organization when they immigrated into India. The word Rajan seemed to have originally signified a chief or a noble, but not a hereditary monarch. But later the word came to be used in both these senses. Kingship evolved from an original tribal chieftainship. The sovereign power in the early Vedic period was certainly democratic and insecure. It based on the ever-changing popular will. It is evident from the frequent attempt to perform sacrificial offerings and spells for the attainment of sovereign power by different persons. The anarchical disturbance due to the frequent election, expulsion and restoration of Chai seems to have led the people to establish monarchical form of government on hereditary basis. Hereditary monarchy thus evolved out of an original democracy or tribal chieftainship. During the early Vedic period, monarchy became almost universal. The influence of various factors including the ethnic environment brought in changes and affected the normal course of evolution, and as such, various types of monarchy or oligarchy came into existence. The Rig Veda preserved a picture of the constitution of the tribal society at its time. The government of each tribal unit was normally vested in a monarch, Rajan. It had indeed been held that oligarchical forms of government were not unknown among the Indo-Aryans. References to monarchical forms of government can be traced in Vedic literature where the king was under the control of the people or law. With regard to the folk element, the institution of kingship were actually direct democracies of the people, and the king's position was virtually that of a permanent executive. Thus a form of constitutional monarchy was introduced with healthy limitations, and it had a long-term effect on the constitution in 2 ways. First, it upheld the rights of the people, a system closed to democracy, and secondly, it enforced duties on the authority, that was the monarch. It was thus a mixed constitution embodying both democratic and monarchic principles in which both were interdependent. The king was bound to rely on the goodwill and support of the kinsmen as well as the people. The influence of the former was immense. We find in the Atharva Veda that the kinsmen of the king, the relatives of the king, together with a number of other important personages, had formed a body of men, who selected the ruling prince and probably guided his conduct. The people thus had a voice in the selection of their king. They were not only in the habit of meeting for the purpose of royal election, but they asserted themselves whenever the king was wrong. On important occasions, they were called into the Samiti or the assembly and their opinion guided the king. The king had to rule the kingdom in accordance with the wishes of the people's assembly. The state of royalty was indeed dependent on popular choice for its accession to office and dependent on popular allegiance for its continuance in authority. Pliny stated that the king was chosen by people with 30 councillors. This choice of the king by the people is an important democratic factor which one cannot easily ignore. The principle of common will was thus an important Helen his will men of his own blood often inhantogenously by his own subjects. The strength of Willie the other who easily 100 men text explains that the unity can be food in dictum or that a king should dimis be the many is more powerful than the king. The rope this by a combination of many this is strong enough to drag the lions found in the ep is that the people had a voice even in the selection of Theas Hindants are found in the Mahabharata. Where the selection of Theo the people, Uayuti could install his youngin instead of the eldest son Vadu who was the technically wile. Another similar incident can be mentioned where Dhritarashtra was impelled to their apparent his nephew instead of his unworthy so why with the politai. The pronto result of the protest of the peer play the most important imitation on the autocratic exercise of political power the nextio K was provided by the authority and function of two institutions the one and the Sabha. The Aryans seem to have settled their own problems through their own Santa Sumiti. These institutions were also called Sana www. The Sumit was an assembly of the people and accord with that was vitally important to the king. He was bound to act up to the unanimous decision of I assembly taking advices Tom the assembly was essential for his prosperity the assemblies enjoyed flumen and had a recognized position in the body politic it was a sovereign assembly of those times since it had the power of electing or appointing the king. Perhaps the matters only were brought before the assembly which required the sanction or approval of the people because they were not already sanctioned by the custom. It was probably the assembly of the entire populace and it was of a politically mature character. The very existence and functioning of the video Sumin is enough to show that the structure of political power in ancient India was non-concentrated and divers I feed in this connection mention may be made of the four kinds of assemblies quoted by Brihaspati in the Hinaharikand of Pirasara Madhava as observed by Deshama Sastri. These were immovable assembly in a town or a village. Movable assembly consisting perhaps of teamed men moving from place to place. Chartered committee, or Madradaksharan Watto with a presiding superintendent and ordered assembly, Rawakachar Sastrita, which had the king for presiding over its deliberations. The Video monarchy was sometimes elective and sometimes hereditary. In the Vidi polity the assembly must have been more important than the king who evidently was at the mercy of the former. During the periods of interregnum to death or denishment or kings, it was the assembly that managed the affairs of a kingdom. The Satha was a council of elders and powerful men. It was a gathering of selected people formed some sort of an advisory body and the king came to be known a dozen chola inscriptions bearing on a Tamil village Nikanji Varati that the council. It can legitimately be generalized from over village safs had in their hands still responsibility for entire administration of rural areas. According to B.R. Ramachandra Dikshita there were four kinds of sabha, pratistita if it were established by the king himself in his royal domains, 2. Apranistita it were a voluntary organization of the villages. 3. Midriti established by the king's secretaries or judges. 4. Sasit if established by the king himself by a royal route. The sabha was compared to human organism. The head was the king. The face secretary, the arms members, the hands sastra, knees accountants and scribes, eyes gold and fire, and feet servants. Each of these 10 members had its own individual and collective functions to perform with hereditary kingship. The place of the early Vedic popular bodies or the assembly was taken up by the ministry. Gradually, Rajasathi and Mantri Parisad took the place of the Samiti and Sabha. During the Gupta period, succession was generally hereditary but the final approval rested with the court and the people. The monarchs were constitutional and took the public opinion with them. There was no trace of autocracy in their mode of conduct and administration. They respect the established laws of the land which was the highest sovereign and formulated by the chosen representatives of the people. The Gupta monarch was bound by many checks and balances. One of them was the Mantri Parisad or simply Parisad. It advised the king on matters of administrative importance. Another check was the Sabha or the assembly. It was an organization of public opinion. The Sabha was a popular assembly of the representatives of the people, citizens of the capital and of the rural parts. The early Buddhists mentioned monarchy as the only form of government, but the ancient Indian polity was not, however, confined to the monarchical sphere. The Hindu constitution grew along republican or non-monarchical lines too. Departure from the normal form was made in post-Vedic times. Sovereignty of the king was dissolved and democratic governments set up in various places. The republican form of government in India came long after monarchy, and after the Kali Vedic age. Dr. Shamasastri drew our attention to the view that perhaps owing to difficulties in deciding the claims of rival claimants to sovereign power or other causes, some states continued to successfully manage their affairs even without a king. According to the Aitanai Bralamana, there were different types of politics in that age. In the eastern countries, we find the form called Samrajaya. The word Samrat is referred to in the Rig Veda. According to Keith, Samrajaya was a loose type of empire in which the overlordship or paramountcy of one state was recognized. J. Aswell held that Samra has signified a combination of monarchies or a federal imperialism around one dominant member. The Rajaya type or kingship was prevalent in the middle country among the Kurus and the Panchalas. The meaning of Rajaya is obvious, the state over which there was a king. In the north not sell beyond the Himalayas among the Uttara Kurus and the Uttara Madras the Virajaya type of polity operated. The word Virajaya may be interpreted in two ways. 1. Without king. 2. A very distinguished king. Virajaya may mean an absence of regal authority or it may connote a higher type of sovereign authority. In the west among the Nisais and Apachais the Svirajaya type of polity was found. Svirajaya might have been a form of self-rule, that is, autonomous tribal states or oligarchies. A prince was a Svera when he was dependent on no one else. He was self-continent of an autocrat so far as his governing authority was concerned. A Svera ruler was the first among equals. It seems that the people in western regions enjoyed more autonomy than in the others. The Borjaya type was a characteristic in the south among the Satvans. Mahabharata mentions Bodja as a class of rulers. Keith interprets Borjaya to mean paramount rule. In the Rig Veda there is a prayer from which it can be inferred that the Vedic Aryans might have been familiar with organized bodies of people, Ganas, living under several leaders or kings. In the Rig Veda we have Raja Samitavina which is explained by Sayana as kings in Samiti. This refers to the existence of a type of political organization which had a Samiti. Popular assembly and many Rajas as leaders. The words like Gana and Mahagana have been used in the Atharva Veda. It can be inferred that there were possibly groups, tribal groups, who lived an organized political life not under any one king or leader but under many kings. The significance of Gana in Buddhistic religious order and the existence of tribal oligarchies called Ganas, like the Vajjas, Malas, Malavas etc. in later times indicates that Gana as a corporate body might have originated at this time. Ganas, therefore, may have been just organized groups, with popular assemblies i.e. Samitis and many Rajas as leaders. Gana numbers, Gana Rajaya will, therefore, mean the rule of numbers, the rule of many. Gana Rajaya consequently denoted a form government by assembly or parliament. The secondary meaning of Gana came to be parliament or senate, and as republics were governed by them, Gana came to mean a republic itself. Gana was a tribal oligarchy, a federation of clans. Each clan had its separate autonomy. Each of these clans consisted of two divisions, Ayakas and Lakeswaras, the people and the rulers. Kautilya mentions 7 republican states or Ganastates, namely Lichavis, Vrijikas, Malakas, Madrakas, Kukuras, Kurus and Panchalas. The leading features of the republics were as follows. The Ganas were aggregates of Kulas and Gotras and were dominated by men of the same caste or family. They seem to have been democratic bodies. B. Sovereignty was vested in the people who had equal rights, participated in public matters and bore arms in war. C. There was a body of Mukhayas or Ganotama who ruled these corporations. All measures required popular approval, and regarding matters requiring secrecy, the leaders deliberated in secret and then public sanction was taken for in accounts to die 4th century AD. There were independent republics with full sovereignty in the Punjab, Fastern Rajputana and Malwa. The central parts of the Punjab were held by the Commonwealth of Madrakas. The Yudhoyas had their territory on both banks of the Sutlej. In the 2nd century Rudradamana, 125-150 inches AD, had inflicted a defeat on them, but centuries before, they came out brilliantly in India. Resistance to Alexander the Abhyas and the Malays were settled between the Chambal and the Betwa. During the conquests of the great Gupta monarch Samstrogopus, 330-75 AD, all these republican nations succeeded in maintaining their autonomy by doing homage and paying tribute. But ultimately they lost their sovereignty and became feudatories or protectorates of the Gupta Empire. The greatest period of Hindu republics lay, however, between the 4th and 6th centuries BC. Saka again tend to compare the republican nationalities of India with those of Sparta, Athens, Thebes and Rome of pre-Christian Europe, and their ultimate extinction through the establishment of the Mauryan Empire, BC 323, synchronized with the annihilation of the Greek city-states by Philip of Macedon at the Battle of Charonsia, BC 338. Megasthenes recorded the Hindu tradition prevailing in his time, BC 302, that during a period of 6,042 years from the time of Dionysius to Sandiocotis a republic was thrice established in India. Certain cities were also mentioned by him where at last the sovereignty was dissolved and democratic government set up. The names he mentioned match with the records of the contemporary Sanskrit texts. The Multikor, the Singho, the Manuni, Eroho and the Rirungi were, as he put, free nations with no kings. They occupied mountain heights where they had built many cities. This was the earliest foreign report about the existence of republican states among the Hindus. The India that was encountered by the Greeks who had preceded Megasthenes by about 20 years, i.e., who belonged to Alexander's hordes previous to Chandragupta Maurya's establishment of the empire and expulsion of Seleucus the Greco-Syrian from Afghanistan, BC 303, was a land of republics and commonwealths, used to assemblies or senates, and leaders or presidents. In the estimation of the Greek soldiers, Padala, for instance, was the Sparta of the Hindus. It was a famous city at the apex of the delta of the Indus. In this community, as Diodorus told us, the command in war was vested in 2 hereditary kings of 2 different houses. While a council of elders ruled the whole state with paramount authority, Lerai indeed in Alexander's days was the number of democratically governed peoples, with the institutions of or self-rule though sometimes of the oligarchy character. One of the most important of these nations was the Eratus, Aristarchus, i.e., kingless, with their kinsmen. The Kathianes, the other nationalities that had a pan-Indian reputation as having figured in the Amy of the Kurus in the mob minute, happened to strike the imagination of the Greeks in an interesting way. These were the Malois, Malavas, and the Oxydracae, Kshudrakas. The former are described by Aryan simply of independent Indians, but the latter are singled out by him as attached to freeds and autonomy from the military standpoint. Both were very powerful people, others' throats, but they fought together against Alexander, and the strength of the combined army was 90,000 fully equipped infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and the 900 chariots. Among the other republican nationalities of the time we know about the Sambastae, the Sabakak, on the statement of Diodorus, that they dwell in cities with democratic form of administration, and about the Gedrosii, Gedrus on the report Curtius, that they were a free people with a council for discuss important matters of state. Another race is mentioned by Curtius, probably the Sabaka, of Diodorus, as a powerful Indian tribe whose form of government was democratic and not regal. They had no king but were led by 3 gen. Their army consisted of 60,000 foot, 6,000 cavalry, and 500 chariots. Similar Kshatriyas were expert naval architects. They supplied Alexander with galleys dtes Theorite, the Abastanoi, the Zathroi, the Kshatriya, and the Irabitae in peoples whom Aryan called the independent tribes with leaders. Of these 30 cars and transport vessels, this cluster of republics represented evidently the survival of a type of power that had been more or less uniformly distributed throughout the Hindu world as older link in the chain of Indias. Political evolution is furnished by the class commonwealths of the 5th and 6th centuries BC, and it is to the Kastamang central regions of northern India, roughly speaking, to the Modem province Bihar, that we have to turn our eyes for these oldest historical specimens of Hind republics. These republican peoples are generally enumerated as 10. In regard 7 of them there is hardly any information of political importance. The Bajai had their headquarters in Samzumara Hill, the Bulis in Alakappa, and the Kalan in Kesaputta. Pitphalivana was the territory of the Marias, and Ramagama the Kalias. There were 2 branches of the Malas, one with sovereignty in Kusinara, and the other in Pava. The most important of these 10 nations were the Sikhis of Kapilavastu, the Vidahas of Mithila and the Lichavis of Vaisali. The last 2 were amalgamated and went by the name of the Vajians. The Sikhis numbered 1 million strong. Their territory lay about 50 miles cast to west and extended 30 or 40 miles south from the foot of the Himalayas. The administrative and judicial business of this republic was carried out in a public assembly. The civic center of Kapilavastu, the capital, as that of other cities of the nation, was the town hall. The young and old alike took part in the deliberations to the government of the country. The chief was elected by the people. He used to preside over the sessions. The title of the president was Raja, literally king, though his function was more of a democratic nature. The Republic of the Vajjayans was United States of ancient India according to Sarkar. It was a federation formed the union of 8 clans that had formerly been distinct and independent of one, but like the Athenians and Spartans they had always been used to flying caste wwwht Vusalt was the headers of this textural republic. The two most sweet of the members of this union were the Vidahas and the Lichebhavi, the west in spintoon of a monarchical state, and their original were 300 miles. Tihi Lichbhavis used to elect a triumvirate of 3 with a distratio and Kaladuan kinds of monarchies. In reality they appeared west and des in monarchy. This was certain that even in the Brahmin Purlaha derivades were read on the monarchical roll, namely that of the two Chitan, the aberrant and the universal monarch, there were women. One was D, which was found in an old Jaina Tamil of 2 Kinnis quarterly, also referred to its China until that we have earnment perished through mutual batter. Partiality valley cattle poke of another kind of hair which consisted of the trade of father and son or of 2 brothers. According to this type the roll www with 2 kinds of and the same ho use athin per monarchy which was somewhat akin to the Sampho form washin in a very other. What Kautilya man was the kingdom motto why do indiviholi, but to a royal family collectively the overdignity of such a kingdom was then vested in a Kutatangha. 2 instances of this monarchical share known before the Mauryans came to the country of Magadha was ruled over by the Sisunaga and Nanda dynasties, after Kalasoka. The last but one prince of the Sisnaga dynasty, the KWK was held by his tens, successively Tit Jolly similarly, the Nants exercised collective supremacy over their empire consisting of one father and height. These are instances of the league, where the kingdom was held othi nemenna, but all the members of a royal family cure your progress. What was the commonly prevalent system of firmament in contacta? How was the most important limitation on the autocratic exercise of political power provided? What according to V.R. Ramachandra were the 4 kinds of Sabha 2. 4 concept of static village community together with caste and joint family village constituted an important component of India socially. Here we will briefly discuss about India villages and village communities together with their various aspects discussed in literature. There is understanding that Haitian villages are statey since ancient times. We will discuss the origin and details of the theory generally. The concept of the statio no village community emerged in the 19th century. The British administrators and Oriental scholars were the main proponents of the idea. It got widespread with the nationalist movement. Indian leaders like Gandhi popularized the notion of the static village and romanticized the idea. The village in Indian conception is integrated to the village service system. The villages consisted of the village community's different artisans. Functionaries and servants formed an essential component of the village community auxiliary to the cultivating population of the village. The village, whether it is the administrative or revenue village or the sociological village, is, in popular notion, a single cluster of houses, or more than one cluster of houses adjoining, situated amid its cultivated fields which define its boundaries. Separate it from other similar units and give it a distinct identity and a name. Colonial notion of Indian village. Our intellectual understanding of an everlasting Indian village community is the product of ideas embedded in the debates on the nature of Indian village community, initiated in the colonial government reports during the 19th century. These reports, in determining from whom they should collect land revenue, discovered the existence of village communities. The term village community too was an intellectual contribution of the colonial rulers. Louis Dumont has distinguished 3 meanings of the expression which seem to predominate in 3 successive historical phases. In the first phase, the village community is primarily a political society, in the second a body of co-owners of the soil, while in the third phase, it becomes the emblem of traditional economy and polity. A watchword of Indian patriotism. Nearly every book that tries to capture the fundamental characteristics of India includes a statement about the Indian village. It is one of the pillars of these imperial constructs of India. Most of these are capsule representations which trace their descent back to the statement of a prestigious servant of the East India Company, Sir Charles Metcalfe, 1785 to 1846. His description of a village republic first appeared in a British parliamentary inquiry of 1810. Even Marx, relying on the writings of 2 on-the-spot commentators, Colonel Mark Wilkes, 17607-1831, company servant in Madras from 1782 to 1801, and Sir George Campbell, 1824 to 1892, who held high posts in India between 1842 and 1874. Produced a text on the Indian village in his momentous Das Kapital, the Discourse on Indian Villages, whether in these thumbnail sketches or in the longer accounts, has depicted the village as the locale where caste, the essential institution of India, appears in the form of a strange community of collective actors and a peculiar political economy of subsistence exchanges, the so-called Jajmani system, the smallest unit of the Indian state. It was, of course, also the site where government revenue was generated and collected. Each village was an inner world, a traditional organic community, self-sufficient in its economy, patriarchal in its governance, surrounded by an outer one of other hostile villages and despotio governments. Munyer Williams wrote, "It has existed almost unaltered since the description of its organization in Manners Code, 2 or 3 centuries before the Christian era. It has survived all the religious, political and physical convulsions from which India has suffered from time immemorial. Invader after invader has ravaged the country with fire and inward. Internal wars have carried devastation into every corner of the land. Tyrannical oppressors have desolated its homesteads. Famine has decimated its peasantry. Pestilence has depopulated entire districts. Floods and earthquakes have changed the face of nature. Folly, superstition, and delusion have made havoc of all religion and morality but the simple. Wealth-contained Indian township has preserved its constitution intact, its customs, precedents, and peculiar institutions unchanged and unchangeable amid all other changes." 1891. 455. The economic characteristics of Indian village are usually summed up as self-sufficiency and isolation. This idea, first propounded by Metcalfe in 1830 and supported by Maine, Marx and Mahatma Gandhi, acquired over years the status of a dogma. Most writers on rural India took for granted the idea of village autonomy and autarky, the 2 words synonymously used for isolation and self-sufficiency. Thus, for instance, Madhav Gadgil notes that the Indian village, on account of the difficulty of communicating with the outside world, was, of course, an almost entirely self-sufficient unit. In other words, the main needs of the community were satisfied locally. The attachment to each village of a complement of village servants intended to meet the daily needs of the village community made largely self-sufficient. These village servants were generally expected to take up service only in the village to which they were attached, and those who engaged themselves in service beyond the village were considered to have transgressed the law. This theory of the unchanging static village circulated the idea that the village had no connection with the outside villages and town. According to Simpkins, the Deccan village was entirely closed economic association. Gadgil himself seems to lose his own moderation when he says that India was characterized by an aloofness from the outside world. It consisted of an immense number of entirely self-contained and self-supplying units with little contact with each other and practically no knowledge of the outside world. According to others, this characteristic of definite isolation went so far that all food grains, pulses and oilseeds were produced in the very villages in which they were consumed, irrespective of the kind of cultivation best suited for the village. In other words, in order to secure economic independence, economic efficiency was sacrificed. But in this extreme form, the idea of rural self-sufficiency is not only misleading, but has resulted in falsifying the true nature of Indian village community. M. N. Srinivas wrote, recent research by sociologists and social anthropologists through their intensive village studies has shown that while roads, especially inter-village roads, were poorly developed, and while monetization of the economy was minimal, and notes when the law on many matters one religious system, the Pawi with these telos in other villages live, and so the we theo the village were by tiaria thualatin evidence of self-sufficiency they shaving within it the essential artisan and Sarah Kingsley Davis. Not est whole village sa full, and that the cases it does have Arabi family est the first that means that each village to exist in the servicens in other villages. And wissen villages which have existed in my village eto ban the isolation for the imply that consumables new to the village. These assured the economy intended at which folk the isolation was the pattern of landdown that relations between caste members must be maintained by which made it visible for an individual to hold in more than one village away and viewed which happened out as the vilhar and sortant nitus results in establishing cantats der and villages in terms of landline and mer dan employment of ABBA, which helped to broaden thus. Individual villages in British were far from being Salu was self-sufficient. Ties office stretches acres villages love of pilgrimage Neville's the present offer Rahim in priest in the villages the visible reports of all D. Sanri histews. Made people travel from one place to an all these see come and religious to highlight the fact that the lake village was always a part of the wider network. Srinivas draws attention's tradition between the fact of subsumption of the village in the wide run with Osni self-sufficiency. While the former sold the self-sutiani with the state and its officials draining away a sizable shoes the village war and mine destroyed the economy of the village. Thuan system and rural mobilities part of the stronghold of caste in the village run light undoubtedly depla wali relationship that roll in some way the distance between high castes low castes due to occupational division of labour incorporated in the an instant role was played in this regard by the village's system and the widow cest professions. This was the basis of the village exchange system. The Brahmin priest contract with all cases 10b to village. The carpenter and blacksmith were in the service of all villages to repair their implements. A continuous supply of karthanware was maintained by the potter all the year round. Similarly, the services of the barber, washerman and cobbler were required all round the year to cater to the needs of the villager. The higher caste people who owned land were at the mercy of low caste people without whose cooperation they could not till and seed their fields, reap the harvest, thresh and winnow the grain and gather the produce of their lands. At the same time, the low castes were also at the mercy of the higher castes to provide them with employment for their daily bread. This interdependence on one another in their daily life made all castes, high and low, to live together. In spite of and amidst the rigid rules of caste noting that there were strict limits for occupational mobility within the village, André Berthiel observes, while members of the specialist group of artisans and others might turn to agriculture, vice versa was almost impossible. It was not just for anyone to become a priest, a barber, a washerman or even a blacksmith or carpenter or a potter. To some extent this was also true of the differentiated roles within agriculture. However poor, Brahmins could not themselves till the land, and no matter howsoever enterprising untouchables could not become substantial landlords. In other words, the distinction between caste occupation grades were at one level structural, among village service castes, some of whom we have noticed above. The 5 artisan castes, Panchakaruka, namely the ironsmith, carpenter, potter, washerman, and barber, served the entire village, particularly the cultivators, and were paid regularly a certain quantity of grain at harvest by those whom they served. The castes, which did not provide regular services or received grain payments, were shepherds, oilmen, toddy tappers, fishermen and traders. However, basket and rope makers, also the village Maya, and leather worker, Champa, from among the untouchables, and butcher, Mulani, from among the Muslim were incorporated in Maharashtra and Deccan, including Karnataka in the village service system of the village community. There are several non-resident itinerant castes and tribes, which periodically entered the village and the village economy marginally. Marx, Maine. Baden-Powell. An important issue on rural India in the 19th century was the question of whether the village held or owned its lands in common, or whether the cultivating households of a village held them severally. The writings of Marx and Engels were central to this debate, either directly or indirectly, because of the role they assigned to the village in their idea of an Asiatic mode of production. Much of what Marx and Engels had to say about Asian villages was supposedly based on evidence provided by British administrators of India, and that since independence a socialist view has come to shape recent works of South Asian history. Tes Maria the villages, thus, a strange world and the villager a strange sort of human. For he thinks that the village lands on which he labours belong not to him who plows them but to the village as a whole. He merely possesses his land, and only then by virtue of his descent from an ancestor and patriarch of the clan, who at the same time was the founder of the village. The village itself belonged to a remote owner or state in the form of an oriental despot. The unity of that state is based in his mind not on real activities and relations, but on imaginary ones. The presence of the spirit of a clan or village deity and of a despot and god couple. Sir Henry Sumner Maine, 1822 to 1888, trained as a classical scholar, took up the study of Indian law, but without learning Sanskrit. Around the time of the mutiny, he wrote in defense of the East India Company. Maine saw the Aryans as establishing full Aryan villages in North India consisting of the territories of their clans or sects. Their lands were originally held in common and they were governed by councils or panchayats. Here he agrees with Marx. Maine repeatedly referred to these villages as brotherhoods. Even though he was well aware of the diversity to be found in many or even most Indian villages, Maine believed that this Indian village antiquated the feudal manner, remaining as an institution where the Germanic village community, the Mark, emerged in the early Middle Ages. India was, thus, in Maine's eyes, a living muscum not just of the ancient, But of those ancients destined to rule the world, the Aryans, the villages held jointly by the Rajputs, Jats and Gujars in the 19th century were, he therefore assumed, direct continuations down into the present of those which were Aryan communal or clan villages earlier, although Maine agreed with Marx that ownership of the land in India was communal. Belonging to the village brotherhood, he rejected the view that the land there, as in other Asiatic despotisms, belonged to the despot or to the state, along with Marx. Maine saw caste as the diacritic that distinguished the Aryans in India from those elsewhere, and like him, he also believed that caste was a transmutation of clan that had, because of its exclusiveness, prevented change in India. Maine was, however, not so subtle as Marx in explaining the changeless nature of the Indian village. The explanation which Maine invoked is a historical one. The chief secret, a very simple one, lied in the extreme isolation of the country until it was opened by maritime adventure. Henry Baden-Powell was a civil servant in the Punjab from 1861 until 1889. Baden-Powell was generally skeptical about the extent to which one could speak of Aryan villages at all. Citing the Orientalist administrator, W. W. Hunter, he argued that the proportion of conquering and settling Aryans to the Aboriginal population would have been small and that, as a result, the former would have been forced to come to terms with the latter. He also criticized Maine's postulation of that type of village in which lands were held in common as necessarily the original and universal type villages of this type were, in the first place, more heterogeneous than Maine led on. The brotherhood, argued Baden-Powell, included inferiors and dependents, tenants, and in fact, forms a kind of hierarchy. The degrees of PR of TICB which are determined by the order in which the various sets of cultivating families have been amalgamated with the community. Why Baden-Powell, like many of his contemporaries, saw India as a fundamentally Dravidian rather than Aryan culture. He made two connected arguments. One is how there were two types of villages in India. The other, clear, is that the type of village thought by Maine and others to be the universally and essentially Indian ope, the jointly held village of the Aryans, was not in effect really a type of village holding. It was a form of aristocratic landholding superimposed on another type. The jointly held villages which Marx and Maine had mistaken as typical were, in fact, the holdings of the very landholding class that was not supposed to exist in and arach their distinct lands, and no lands, cultivated or waste, were held in common. This other type of village, the more widely distributed one, was that which had come to be called Rayvatari. It was one in which separate households had the village as a whole. Ownership in those households was vested in the patriarch. They were not joint families, in which male offspring automatically became coparceners. The Rayvatari village, Baden-Powell concluded, seems to depend originally on the idea that the house father is the separate and sole owner, whilst the joint village represents the more developed idea of the joint family. The matrix of the typical Indian village community was, thus, the Dravidian, or some other aboriginal, race. The Aryan race together with other Latticomanices, was the matrix of the jointly held village, a form of landholding imposed on the Kalia severalty form. Either of these races, however, inscribed village India on a tabula rasa. They developed it, during India's formative centuries, in interaction with one another and in response to needs arising in the distinctive natural, social and political environment of India. The essence he manufactured was thus found so much in any one race as it was in the interactions of races with each other and their environments. Baden-Powell thus broke with the idea that the village was inherently democratic or republican in its constitution because it was a unit of communal landholding, all of whose members were, at least in origin, members of a single clan or brotherhood. For him, the village was, in its essence, a community of separate cultivating holders and other village functionaries organized as a small monarchy or oligarchy. He furthermore believed that the typical Indian village was not an Aryan institution. It was, more likely, a Dravidian, or Aboriginal, one that existed in a tribal form. Before the arrival of the Aryans, these, their ancestors, had, of course, gained ascendancy over the non-Aryan and even retained their own Western institutions as their landlords. But they can only be said to have modified the institutions of the non-Aryans. The Aryans, like their British descendants at district headquarters, were the managers, the jungle officers of the other, and no longer its progenitor. The main point, though, is that Indian villages were from now on to be seen as Indian problems. The Dravidian village, where Oriental despotism nature notes is supposed to believe, had no analogue in Europe. It did not evolve from the same origin. Nothing, for, was to be learned from it that had application to any situation in Europe or Britain, especially Ireland. 2.5 Check your progress. 6. What were the economic characteristics of Indian villages? 7. How were the members of the villages bound? Summary. The nature of the state in ancient India is one of the most discussed topics in history. Historians entered long debates since the 19th century till Tito understand the structures of the ancient polities. In the middle of the 1970s and the early 1980s the debate reached its zenith. Before that A.S. Alchika, K.A. Nilakanta Sastry and Surajit Sinha enriched our ideas on the subject. In the 1950s and 60s D.D. Kasambi and R.S. Sharma debated over the topic. Romula Thapar, B.D. Chattopadhyaya, G.W. Spencer, Bertenstein and D. Herman Kulp nurtured these new thoughts. They based their studies on the observation of the socio-cultural and historical developments that led to the formulation of the political state. D.D. Kasambi initiated the idea of interconnections and plurality. He drew our attention to the role of the tribal polities in the historical evolution of ancient Indian political system. But later his ideas went to the backdrop to make way to more centrist visions. The Dharmasatrists do not tell us much about the definition of the state. The reason was that the institution was not yet evolved to a mature stage at the time. It was only after rise of states like Kosala and Magadha and Thij of Buddha, 5th century BCE, that the state was defined for the first time in the Sastra of Kautilya as consisting of 7 elements. The Puranas, the Mahabharata and the Buddhist and Jain traditions however provide a different picture of the origin of the state. The Buddhist sources not only emphasize the importance of the rise of private property, but also referred to the role of family in this context. Since the 1970s, scholars stressed on the role of the marginal communities in the formation of the ancient state. The Mauryan Empire was the outcome of a series of favorable situations for state formation in the northern Gangetic plain. It gathered its wealth from the huge revenue collected from the vast northern Indian plain. The ancient Indian states owe a lot to the tribal cultures around them. Sanskrit literature divided space into two broad categories, Vanilla Ranaya and Napadoxatra. While the former represented jungle, the later meant plough agriculture and settled habitation. Exceptions or aberrations. The view is based on the apparent perception in ancient India was monarchy and instances of republic were either. The Aryans had no monarchical organization when they immigrated into Cebu. but not a hereditary monarch. But later the word came to be used in Nadi that the commonly prevalent system of government it is generally presumed bar since there were kings in ancient India. The system was that of monarchy, India. The word Rajan seemed to have originally signified a chief or both these senses. The most important limitation on the autocratic exercise of political power by the Vedic king was provided by the authority and functions of two institutions, the Samin and the Sabha. In the 4th century AD there were independent republics with full sovereignty in the Punjab, eastern Rajputana and Malwa. The central parts of the Punjab were held by the Commonwealth of Madrakis. The Yudhaish had their territory on both banks of the Sutlej. Kautilya described different kinds of monarchies. In reality they appeared Brahmana period 3 district grades were recognized in the monarchical rule, namely that of the feudatory chieftain, the overlord and the universal, together with caste and joint family. Village constituted an important component of India's rural society. The members of the village were bound by ties of kinship, marriage, economic obligations, etc., with caste fellows in other villages. Even so, the multi-caste composition of the village has been held out as an evidence of self-sufficiency. Monarch 2. 6 key terms. Dharmasastras, any of a class of Sanskrit prose texts concerned with law and rules of conduct. Dharma. Dharmasastras differ from Dharmaastras in that the former consist of prose or mingled prose and verse, while the latter consist exclusively of verse. Brahmanas. The Brahmanas are a collection of ancient Indian texts with commentaries on the hymns of the 4 Vedas. Notes self 2.7 answers to check your progress 1. The 4th element mentioned in Kautilya is Chaga that literally means fortress, but it is often used as a synonym of pura and refers to a fortified capital. 2. The first mention of the contract theory was in the 2 Brahmanas that described the election of the king from among the gods for the purpose of fighting the Asuras. 3. It is generally presumed that the commonly prevalent system of government in ancient India was monarchy and instances of republic were either exceptions or aberrations. 4. The most important limitation on the autocratic exercise of political power by the Vedic king was provided by the authority and functions of two institutions, the Samiti and the Sabha. 5. According to V.R. Ramachandra Dikshita there were 4 kinds of Sabha. 1. Pratistita if it were established by the king himself in his royal domains. 2. Apratistita if it were a voluntary organization of the villages. 3. Mudrita if established by the king's secretaries or judges. 4. Sasita if established by the king himself by a royal writ. 6. The economic characteristics of Indian villages are usually summed up as self-sufficiency and isolation. 7. The members of the village were bound by ties of kinship, marriage, economic obligations, etc., with caste fellows in other villages. 2.8 Questions and exercises. Short answer questions. 1. State the 7 elements enumerated by Kautilya. 2. Write a short note on the contract theory. 3. Comment on the Vedic and the post-Vedic period. Long answer questions. 1. Describe the Saptanga theory of R.S. Sharma. 2. Discuss the role of the tribal societies. 3. Analyze the concept of static village community. 2.9 Further readings. Taylor, Louise 1890. The Origin of the Era in an Account of the Prehistory. See Ethnology and Civilization of Europe, New York. Scribner and Welford, Jonathan Mark Kenaya, 1998. Ancient Cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, Oxford University Press. Davlika, Madhuka Keshav 2007. The Aryans. Myth and Archaeology. New Delhi, Munshiram Manoharlal Publishers. Malik, Kenan 1996. The Meaning of Race, History and Culture in Western Society. London, Macmillan Wheeler, Sir Mortimer 1979. The Inca Civilization. 3rd edition. Cambridge.